The ranch hands thought he was just another drifter who'd found work with horses. But when desperate criminals chose the wrong property to hide their kidnapped victim, they learned that some men retire from war, but war never retires from them. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden courage and protective instincts, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments of quiet heroism deserve to be remembered. Sunset Ranch, stretched across 400 acres of Montana grassland, rolling hills dotted with oak trees and horses that moved like living poetry. It was the kind of place city folks dreamed about when life got too complicated. Jake Morrison had been working the ranch for 8 years, ever since old man Peterson hired him after a brief phone conversation. No references, no background check, just a handshake and promise to work hard. Jake kept his word. He showed up before dawn, stayed past sunset, never caused trouble. The other ranch hands called him Cowboy, though he never corrected them. He was quiet, competent, kept to himself. Medium height, weathered skin, calloused hands that handled horses with surprising gentleness. When the younger guys went to town Saturday nights, Jake stayed behind to check on the animals. "That man's got secrets," Maria Santos, the ranch cook, often told her husband. "Seen a lot of drifters come through here, but none moved like him." She was right. It was the way he scanned the horizon when he thought no one was looking. How he positioned himself where he could see both the main road and back trails. The careful way he maintained his pickup truck, like someone who might need to leave quickly. What Maria didn't know was that Jake Morrison had spent 15 years with the FBI's hostage rescue team. He'd led operations in places that didn't appear on maps, brought home victims from situations that made headlines for weeks. His real name wasn't Jake Morrison, and Montana wasn't his first choice for retirement. 8 years ago, after one operation went sideways and good people paid the price, he'd walked away from federal service forever. The horses didn't ask questions about his past, and the wide spaces helped quiet the voices that echoed in his head during long nights. Tuesday morning started like every other morning at Sunset Ranch. Jake was in the main stable by 5:30 a.m., feeding horses their morning grain and checking each animal for injury or illness. Thunder, a gray gelding with serious attitude problems, nipped at Jake's shoulder while he cleaned the stall. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice carrying the patience of someone who understood that trust took time to build. No need to be difficult today. The ranch ran 12 horses, mostly quarter horses used for trail rides and cattle work. Peterson had built a decent business taking city tourists on guided rides through the Montana wilderness. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep the operation running and employ 6 full-time hands. Jake's official job was ranch maintenance, fixing fences, maintaining equipment, general labor. But he'd gradually become the go-to person for horse care. The animals responded to his calm energy in ways that surprised even Peterson. "Never seen anything like it," the owner had told his wife after watching Jake gentle a spooked mare. "That horse was traumatized from abuse, wouldn't let anyone near her for months. Jake spent 3 weeks just sitting in her stall, not even trying to touch her. Now she follows him around like a puppy." What Peterson didn't understand was that Jake recognized trauma because he'd seen it in mirrors and fellow operators for 15 years. Some wounds took time to heal, whether they belonged to horses or humans who'd seen too much. Around 7 a.m., the other ranch hands began arriving. Carlos and Miguel, brothers from Guatemala who sent most of their wages home to family. Tommy, a local kid working summers before college. Sarah, a horse trainer from Colorado who'd come to Montana for this space and stayed for reasons she never quite explained. They were good people, honest workers who'd become the closest thing to family Jake had known since leaving federal service. He'd never told them about his past, but they'd stopped asking personal questions years ago. Some stories were too heavy to share over morning coffee. At 10:15 a.m., Jake was replacing fence line near the back pasture when he heard vehicles approaching. Not unusual. Peterson had trail rides scheduled, but something about the engine sounds made Jake pause and listen carefully. 2 vehicles moving fast, engines working harder than they should on gravel. Jake's enhanced hearing caught details others would miss. Heavy suspension. Probably SUVs. No patrol pattern, just direct approach. Jake continued working, but his awareness shifted into a mode he hadn't accessed in 8 years. Peripheral vision expanded, breathing deepened, muscle memory activated systems that had kept him alive where mistakes were measured in body counts. The vehicles turned toward the ranch's back entrance, a service road Peterson used for hay deliveries. That was wrong. Tourists used the front entrance. Hay deliveries weren't scheduled. Legitimate visitors didn't approach at high speed. Through oak trees, Jake caught glimpses of black SUVs with tinted windows. Government plates would have been visible from this distance. These had standard civilian registration. The approach pattern suggested something else entirely. Jake set down his tools and moved toward the tree line using cover techniques that felt natural as breathing. His truck was 50 yards away, and his emergency kit was secured under the rear seat. He'd hoped never to need it again. The SUVs stopped at the old hay barn, a structure Peterson rarely used except for equipment storage. Jake was close enough now to observe without being detected. 4 men exited the vehicles, 2 from each SUV. They moved with purpose but not professional discipline. Armed, definitely. Tactical gear, but civilian market equipment. The passenger from the lead vehicle opened the rear door and pulled someone out. A small figure that made Jake's blood run cold. A child. Maybe 8 or 9 years old, hands zip-tied behind her back, mouth taped, moving with the terrified compliance of someone who'd learned that resistance brought pain. Jake's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The quiet ranch hand disappeared, replaced by 15 years of federal training and operational experience. His breathing slowed automatically. His heart rate dropped. His vision sharpened with the hyperactive focus that had made him one of the Bureau's most effective operators. This wasn't a random crime. The kidnappers had specifically chosen Peterson's ranch as a hideout, probably based on surveillance suggesting it was isolated and lightly staffed. They'd done their homework, but missed the most important detail. Jake counted weapons, assessed positioning, noted vehicle placement. The kidnappers were professionals, but not military trained. Probably private security gone bad or organized crime operatives. Their equipment was decent, but their tactics were sloppy. They'd positioned themselves with poor sight lines and limited escape routes. More importantly, they'd brought a kidnapped child to a location where Jake Morrison had access to tools and knowledge that could turn their carefully planned operation into their worst nightmare. Some mistakes couldn't be undone. Jake retreated silently to his truck, his mind already running through tactical options. His emergency kit contained items he'd hoped never to use again: encrypted communication device, tactical knife, first aid supplies, and a disassembled Glock 19 that technically shouldn't exist according to any federal database. He assembled the weapon with muscle memory, checked the magazine, chambered a round. 15 years of skills he'd tried to forget came flooding back like water through a broken dam. Breach protocols, close quarters combat, hostage extraction under fire. The rational part of his mind suggested calling federal backup, but Jake knew the timeline. A kidnapped child had maybe hours before the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Local sheriff was 30 minutes away. FBI field office was 2 hours. By the time professional help arrived, this would be over, one way or another. Jake's encrypted device showed no federal surveillance in the area. He still had access to certain databases, though he'd never used them during his ranch years. The kidnappers had chosen their location well. No air support, no ground units, no backup coming. Which meant Jake was alone with his training, his equipment, and 8 years of guilt that told him he'd walked away from protecting innocent people when they needed him most. Jake moved through the oak grove using techniques perfected in hostage rescues across 3 continents. Sound discipline, natural cover, approach angles that minimized exposure while maximizing tactical advantage. The kidnappers had posted no security, confident in their isolation. 40 yards from the barn, Jake could hear voices through the weathered wooden walls. 2 men inside with the child, 2 outside setting up communication equipment, probably waiting for ransom demands or extraction orders. "Boss wants confirmation we have the package," one voice said. "Kid secure, no problems during transport." "How long we staying here?" "Until we get the go-ahead. Could be hours, could be days." Jake's jaw tightened. Extended timeline meant increased danger for the victim. Kidnappers who held hostages for days typically didn't plan to release them alive. This wasn't a simple ransom operation. This was something darker. Jake positioned himself where he could observe the barn's interior through gaps in the wooden siding. The child was a girl, maybe 9 years old, sitting on a hay bale with her hands still restrained. She wasn't crying anymore, which worried Jake more than tears would have. That level of compliance in a child suggested prolonged trauma. The kidnappers were armed with handguns and what looked like one rifle. Professional equipment but amateur positioning. They'd clustered together instead of establishing proper overwatch. No communications discipline, no counter-surveillance protocols. Jake had extracted hostages from worse situations with full team support. Solo extraction was exponentially more dangerous, but not impossible. The key was speed, violence of action, and exploiting the kidnappers' tactical mistakes before they realized their error. Jake's attack came like summer lightning, sudden, devastating, over before the kidnappers understood what hit them. He approached from their blind spot, using the barn's structure to mask his movement until he was close enough to engage. The first kidnapper never saw him coming. Jake's knife work was surgical, quiet, final. The second man turned at the sound of his partner falling and found himself facing someone who'd perfected close-quarters combat in places where hesitation meant death. 2 down, 2 to go. Jake breached the barn using techniques that had served him in Beirut, Mogadishu, and a dozen other operations that existed in classified files. The third kidnapper was reaching for his weapon when Jake's training took over. Controlled pairs, center mass, threat neutralized. The fourth man had positioned himself behind the child, using her as a human shield, classic hostage scenario. Jake had trained for this exact situation hundreds of times. "Drop your weapon," the kidnapper screamed, pressing his gun against the girl's head. "I'll kill her." Jake's response was calm, professional, utterly without fear. "Number you won't." What happened next took 2.3 seconds. Jake's shot placement was perfect, a precision headshot that neutralized the threat without endangering the hostage. 15 years of training distilled into one moment of absolute competence. The silence that followed was different from the ranch's usual quiet. This was the heavy stillness that comes after violence, when adrenaline fades and reality settles like dust after an explosion. Jake secured the scene with automatic precision, checking each threat to ensure they were neutralized. Then he turned his attention to the child, who was staring at him with eyes too old for her face. "Hey there," Jake said gently, holstering his weapon and approaching slowly. "My name's Jake. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" "Emma," she whispered. "Are the bad men gone?" "Yes, sweetheart, they can't hurt you anymore." Jake cut her restraints with careful precision, noting signs of prolonged captivity. Dehydration, exhaustion, psychological trauma. She'd been missing for days, maybe longer. He wrapped her in his jacket and carried her toward his truck, calling federal contacts he'd hoped never to use again. "Jake to Federal Operations Center," he spoke into his encrypted device. "This is Morrison, badge number 2847. I have a recovered kidnapping victim and need immediate federal response to my location." The voice on the other end paused. "Morrison, you've been off-grid for 8 years. What's your status?" "Solo extraction, 4 hostiles neutralized, victim secure. Sending coordinates now." 40 minutes later, Sunset Ranch was crawling with federal agents, EMTs, and forensics teams. Peterson stood by his farmhouse, staring as his quiet ranch hand coordinated with FBI supervisors like he'd been doing it his whole life. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, Jake's former supervisor, approached him as EMTs loaded Emma into an ambulance. "Jake Morrison, we've been wondering where you disappeared to." "I retired," Jake said simply. "Funny way of staying retired." Walsh gestured toward the barn. 4 professional kidnappers, solo takedown, 0 collateral damage, victim recovered alive. Jake watched the ambulance carrying Emma disappear down the ranch road. "Some things you don't retire from." Walsh studied his face. "We could use someone with your skills. There are other children out there." "No," Jake's voice was final. "I did my job today. That's enough." The other ranch hands had gathered near the farmhouse, staring at Jake like they'd never seen him before. Carlos approached cautiously. "Jake," he said quietly, "who are you, man?" "Really?" Jake looked at the people who'd become his family over 8 years. "I'm the guy who takes care of the horses. Everything else is just old business." 3 days later, Jake was back to his morning routine. feeding horses, mending fences, living the quiet life he'd built far from federal operations and classified missions. The only difference was the newspaper on Peterson's kitchen table, with headlines about a kidnapping ring broken up and a missing child returned safely to her family. Peterson never asked questions about what happened in his hay barn. The federal agents had cleaned up efficiently, leaving no trace except repaired bullet holes and a brief news story that credited local law enforcement with the rescue. But something had changed in Jake Morrison. The guilt he'd carried for 8 years, the weight of walking away from protecting innocent people, had lifted slightly. Not erased, but lightened by the knowledge that when a child needed help, he had answered the call. Emma sent him a drawing 2 weeks later, delivered through federal channels. It showed a man in a cowboy hat standing next to horses, with the words, "Thank you, Jake," written in crayon. He pinned it to the wall of his trailer, the first personal decoration he'd allowed himself since arriving at the ranch. Sometimes, heroes don't wear badges or uniforms. Sometimes they wear work boots and feed horses at dawn, carrying skills they hope never to use again. But when evil chooses the wrong hiding place, when innocence needs protection, some men step forward with everything they've learned in darker places. Jake Morrison had tried to retire from war, but war had found him one more time. And when it did, he remembered why he'd learned to fight in the first place, not for glory or recognition, but for children who deserved to go home safely. That's the most important mission of all. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Jake? Someone who seemed ordinary until the moment they revealed the depths of their courage and skill? Someone whose quiet presence made you feel safer without knowing why? Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today, and share their story with us.